A seemingly innocuous operation intended to relieve the breathing difficulties of patients suffering from allergies has instead turned their lives into a nightmare. Imagine losing the ability to breathe naturally. What was once a regular, peaceful, unconscious action now requires constant, conscious effort to draw air. Alongside this disruption in your breathing, you experience a burning sensation in your nose, a feeling of suffocation, and shortness of breath. Yet, doctors dismiss your condition as imaginary, telling you it doesn't exist and that you are simply tired. Patients with this syndrome typically have undergone a septoplasty or turbinate reduction, a procedure that involves removing or reducing the turbinates of the nose. These organs secrete moisture, warm and filter the air, and produce nasal nitric oxide that dilates lung vessels. They also give the lungs natural air resistance, allowing full expansion during inhalation, which is crucial for proper gas exchange. Over the past 50 years, it has become increasingly common among ENT surgeons to remove or reduce these organs to alleviate nasal congestion. This is what happened to Brett Helling, 36, as reported by BuzzFeed in an extensive investigation into a condition known as empty nose syndrome. Here is Brett's story. When Brett Helling turned 36 on January 29, 2015, he was living in his parents' basement in Worthington, Ohio, a well-heeled suburb of Columbus. His mom made him his favorite dinner, roast beef and mashed potatoes with Texas sheet cake for dessert. Brett's friends sent him happy birthday messages on Facebook, some asking where he'd been and why they hadn't seen him in so long. Down the road at Natalie's coal-fired pizza and live music, where Brett had been working fewer and fewer bartending shifts, his coworkers texted him, begging him to come celebrate. But he didn't want to be seen. He couldn't do anything but lie on the couch, listless, trying to ignore the sensation of suffocation that had been plaguing him for nearly a year. It started in middle school with allergies that only got worse over time. As an adult, Brett struggled with sinus infections that refused to go away. They clogged his ears, gave him headaches, and led to restless nights. It got so bad that in February 2014, he decided to have an ear, nose, and throat doctor perform a septoplasty, a routine sinus surgery to correct a deviated septum. His older brother had undergone the same surgery. After lying low for about a week, Brett returned to his bartending gig. He told his doctor in follow-up appointments that something felt too open. The doctor assured him that barely anything was removed during the surgery. But over the next several months, Brett couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. His breathing was all messed up. In fact, he couldn't even feel himself breathing through his nose. Instead of steady, rhythmic breathing, he felt like he was constantly coming up for air. And it was more than that. His senses felt dulled, like he'd had a lobotomy. Emotions he used to access easily now seemed far away, out of reach. Everything felt like nothing. No one was concerned about Brett before his surgery. He played guitar and bass, gigging often with several bands. He was a cheerleader for his friends, especially his bandmates and others in the Columbus indie rock community. At work, regulars would come to Natalie's just to see him. So it wasn't until summer that Brett's friends and family started taking his complaints seriously. He worked fewer hours, spent more time at his parents' house, and stopped showing up to band rehearsals. While researching his symptoms online, Brett came across something called empty nose syndrome, a rare, controversial condition that can occur after surgical procedures on cylindrical structures inside the nose called turbinates. At first, he was relieved. Empty nose syndrome sounded horrific, but the good thing was he had surgery only on his septum, not his turbinates. And yet, the symptoms these patients talked about sounded so much like his own. The nasal dryness, the paradoxical open yet suffocating feeling, panic, insomnia, fatigue, anxiety, and depression. In August, Brett dug out his surgical report. There, alongside the septoplasty, were the two words he feared most: turbinate reduction. He fell to his knees, hugged his dog, and cried. He hadn't paid attention to the other supposedly routine procedures his doctor had glossed over. They were presented to him as fine print, as nothing to worry about. Brett was convinced his surgery had given him empty nose syndrome, but his doctor disregarded his concerns. Another ENT physician told him he was just having anxiety. It was a conservative surgery, nothing to worry about. Breathe through your mouth, the doctor told him. That fall and winter, all Brett could think or talk about was his nose. He was constantly fussing with it, rubbing it, wiping it. By mid-October, he had checked himself into the ER and told the nurse, "I need to sleep or I'm going to die." None of the nurses or doctors had heard of empty nose syndrome. They diagnosed him with depression, but Brett told them it was an ENT emergency. According to Brett, the ER doctor replied, "The head of ENT here doesn't think so and will not see you." A few days after Brett was discharged from the ER, he began calling around to ask for painkillers and tranquilizers. Concerned friends started calling Brett's bandmate Sean Gardner and Gardner's wife Molly, who had known Brett for years and dated him in her early 20s. Molly called Brett's girlfriend, who told her she knew he needed help and that she'd tried over and over again to help, but Brett wouldn't listen to her. The Gardners decided to go see him. "Right when we got there, we were like, 'Oh shit,' Molly says. The dog immediately jumped into my arms. Brett's like, 'Sorry, he's just looking for some normalcy. I've been a little crazy.' He kept asking for beer," Sean says. "We were listening to records, and he was turning them up super loud while we were trying to talk to him. He was pacing and kept saying the same 5-minute conversation about turbinates over and over. He wasn't showering, not eating, not sleeping," Molly says. "All he could do was this loop." Eventually, the Gardners convinced Brett to check himself into Harding Hospital, Ohio State's psychiatric treatment center, where Molly works as a nurse. Brett stayed at Harding for about a week, and when he got out, his friends and family were hopeful. They thought he might start sleeping, and maybe the prescribed antidepressants would do the trick. But he didn't stick with them or the psychologist. He felt like no one was listening to him. His head wasn't the problem. Someone needed to fix his nose. In December, Brett and his girlfriend broke up. He tried to tend the bar, but working while feeling on the verge of drowning was torturous. To get through a shift, he'd sometimes run to the liquor store across the street to buy a pack of gum, which helped force him to mouth breathe. And even though music was his greatest love, he stopped playing guitar. He moved back into his childhood home, where he spent his days and nights pacing the house with Kleenex stuffed up his nose. "I can't live like this. This is miserable," he told his parents. "I have no life now. I want my life back. I had a good life." On Monday, February 16, 2015, 4 days shy of the 1-year anniversary of his surgery, Brett drove his green Ford Focus down Interstate 71 in the snow toward Cincinnati. After crossing the Jeremiah Morrow Bridge, the tallest in Ohio, he parked near a closed rest stop, set his iPhone on the center console, rolled down his window, and got out of the car. Snow whipped around his face. It was severely cold, the wind chill well below zero. His hands were white, his cheeks red. Low temperatures dried out his nose even more than usual, and the cold air hurt. Even though his mom had recently bought him a nice orange coat, he wore only a blue hoodie, black pants, and a winter hat. The highway was under construction, and Brett walked north along a closed portion toward the bridge. A construction worker asked him where he was going, and Brett told him he was trying to get to the other side. The worker told him he could drive him across and that he should come warm up in his truck. Brett shook his head and kept walking. Once he hit the bridge, Brett took off running, then stopped and looked over the edge. Climbing a parapet, he dangled his legs over the side, hung on briefly, then dropped 55 meters. Turbinate reductions are routinely performed around the world, sometimes with success. But some patients say this surgical procedure ruined their lives. In Michael Jackson's wrongful death suit, one of his doctors testified that Jackson's insomnia could have been a result of empty nose syndrome. Online ENS forums and Facebook support groups are filled with people who say they've been discarded by doctors who told them nothing is wrong, that it's psychogenic, all in their heads. In China, one man who said he had empty nose syndrome became so enraged that he stabbed an otolaryngologist to death. Others direct violence toward themselves. When regular ENS commenters go silent online, the community wonders if they're gone for good. Brett Helling is not the only person whose life has been ruined by turbinate reduction and septoplasty. Tens of thousands of people worldwide have had their lives shattered by these operations. Most of their stories remain anonymous, and the world is unaware of their suffering. Brett is just one of hundreds who have ended their suffering after developing empty nose syndrome.
Hello. All right. It's time to wrap up this video, but before that, I have a few final words to say. These ENS victims is treated incredibly unfairly by the society. Often, they signed up for a septoplasty but unknowingly received a turbinate reduction as well. These patients are frequently misled into the surgery, with only the risks of bleeding and infection mentioned. When their lives are subsequently ruined, the surgeons feign ignorance and claim their noses look fine. Often, they try to gaslight the patients, suggesting that their problems are psychological. When patients seek justice, doctors and surgeons refuse to support them. This often results in the individuals being unable to work, while society denies them financial compensation. These people are stripped of everything, often losing their careers, friends, jobs, and partners. This is the harsh reality faced by victims of the new era lobotomy, turbinate reduction. Many were given a life sentence by their surgeons when their turbinates were removed, all because they trusted a doctor who claimed to be an expert. Furthermore, in most countries, it is virtually impossible to sue the surgeons or the hospital, so there is no justice to be found. It is therefore sadly not surprising that we have seen 3 attacks on ENT surgeons in recent years.